Breaks in Enlightenment. Besides the main fracture of Enlightenment through the hegemonic powers politics of anti-reflection, which consciously tries to preserve the naivety of others, we observe further breaks and unevenness in the development of Enlightenment that manoeuvres it to the edge of self-denial. The breaking through time. Enlightenment is a process in time, a form of evolution. It uses up life-time in the case of individuals, process time in the case of institutions. Nothing happens overnight with it, although jumps and abrupt awakenings are not foreign to it. Its rhythm is difficult to predict, and it varies infinitely according to inner and outer conditions and resistances. Analogous to the image of the flame, its energy is most intense at the centre and dies down at the periphery. Starting from the pioneers and masters of reflective intelligence in philosophy and the arts, its impulse is refracted initially in the milieu of a intelligentsia with its inertia. Then, in the world of social labour and politics, further in the countless private spheres split off from the universal, and is finally reflected back by pure misery that can no longer be enlightened. Biographically, Enlightenment knows many stages and steps that earlier were strikingly represented in the esoteric movements. In the old Freemasonry, an initiation process was staged that was intended to represent the sequence of maturation, reflection, practice, and illumination. This indispensable biographical system of stages of enlightenment, as initiation, is corrupted in modern pedagogy. The system of stages lives on only superficially in the graduated order of the educational system and in the sequence of school years and semesters. The curricula in modern schools are parodies of the idea of development. In the old Humboldtian university, with its authoritarian relation between teachers and learners and its student freedoms, a trace of that biographical consolidation and an opportunity for personal initiation into knowledge still lived on. In the modern educational system, the idea of embodied knowledge in those who teach, as well as in those who study, is lost. The professors are really not confessors, but coaches in courses for the acquisition of a knowledge removed from life. The universities and schools practice a schizoid role-playing in which an unmotivated, prospectless but intelligent youth learns to keep up with the general standards of enlightened meaninglessness. In the temporal refraction of enlightenment, we distinguish a biographical and a sociological dimension. Each new generation requires its own time to process in its own rhythm what has already been achieved. But since schizoid culture works towards a depersonalization of enlightenment, an enlightenment without embodied enlighteners, a great big groan issues from modern schools. Its apparatus of enlightenment confronts youth from the position of an opponent. If there were no teachers who desperately made every effort for enlightenment in spite of instruction, and who invested their vital energies in the pedagogic process in spite of conditions, scarcely any pupils would still experience what school should be about. The more systematically education is planned, the more it is a matter of accident or luck whether education as initiation into conscious living still takes place at all. With the sociological breaking of enlightenment in time, it is the province in the concrete, as well as metaphorical sense, that resists the impulse of enlightenment with its inertia. Province means accommodation to repressions and hardships that actually no longer exist. Only in the idle mode of habituation and self-repression do they remain effective. unnecessarily. In the age of advanced enlightenment, one really feels for the first time how deadly substanceless misery and how wretched outmoded unhappiness are. The province has taken part in modernisation without participating in liberalisation. It has gone along and yet remained behind. Today this picture is of course changing. A relative inversion in the tendencies of urban and rural consciousness can be distinguished. Certain signs make it clear that a stifling retardation is not the same as an insightful not wanting to go further. A new provincial consciousness emphasises that enlightenment cannot pledge itself for all time to a blind alliance with the scientific, technical, industrial complex, even if the latter has been its inseparable companion for centuries. The social forefront of enlightenment today aims at a qualification of that technical enlightenment with whose unleashing the hot phase of our history began. In it can be discovered traces of myth, dreams of a rational magical mastery of nature, omnipotence fantasies of political engineers. In the culture of technology, urban imperialisms are realised. Increasingly, voices of considerable theoretical weight, from Toynbee to Wittfogel, have elaborated on a premonition of how the future of urban and industrial civilizations should be called the new province. The breaking by the party. Those who inquire after the political subject of enlightenment become lost in a maze. The split in motivations for enlightenment between liberalism and socialism, the latter of which in turn branches into authoritarian communist, social democratic and anarchist currents, goes back to basic principles. Each party has loudly claimed for itself a special relation, indeed an intimate identity with enlightenment and science. Liberalism bears in its very name not only economic freedom, but also civil freedom and freedom of thought. Social democracy has presented itself for ages now as the party for the rational guidance of social developments. And communism steals the show by presenting itself as the current in which partiality, Parteilichkeit, and insight into truth have become one. Whom should we believe? For those who are still free enough to pose the question, there is probably no alternative than to resort to one's own reflection, whereby potentially a new Enlightenment party, that of one's own opinion, could arise. Those free enough to do this are possibly also free enough to agree with the anti-party impulse of anarchism that attacks all parties as surrogates of the state and accuses them of being mechanisms of stupefaction and apparatuses for recruiting the fatuous electorate. The wonderful sounding dialectical phrase about truth and partiality thus remains a pipe dream, until one can discover an impartial party that serves universal life interest by intervening in the blind mechanisms of self-destruction. The breaking by sectors. Especially the advanced thrusts of enlightenment that question the fictions of a clear self-consciousness, of nature and identity, are unhesitatingly opposed even today by great social powers that operate with these fictions. This can easily be demonstrated in the case of depth psychological enlightenment, which became involved in a battle on two fronts with other fractions of enlightenment. The latter performed a thorough job of counter-enlightenment on it. On one side, the psychology of the unconscious was unrelentingly quote-unquote disproved and accused of being mythology by scientism and natural scientific medicine. Let me try that again. On one side, the psychology of the unconscious was unrelentingly disproved and accused of being mythology by scientism and natural scientific medicine. On the other side, it was denounced by official Marxism as a symptom of bourgeois irrationalist decadence. Psychological and political enlightenment are in fact opponents, in that they are not only complete for the free energies of individuals, but also often come into conflict at the heart of the matter. As soon as proclivities for a party coagulate in identities, so that individuals do not merely support a party, but become a party, psychological reflection must inevitably have a decomposing effect on such artificial naivety. It thereby slips into the role of an unwelcome enlightenment. Conversely, psychological enlightenment puts itself in a bad light when it starts to become a Weltanschauung, a school of opinion, an ideology, or even a sect. One sees this in the many pitiful squabbles and dogmatisms of a new psychological orthodoxy, as well as in the ossifications and demarcations of a psychologizing subculture. It becomes really scandalous when psychologists, for example Carl Gustav Jung, through a combination of ambition and naivety have tried to win favour with political currents such as fascism. Instead of providing a psychology of authority and an illumination of political masochism, the leaders of schools of psychology have been inclined to taste the sweetness of authority and to use masochistic mechanisms to their own advantages. The break in intelligence. I just indicated that the alliance of enlightenment with the process of natural scientific, technical civilization is no longer unambiguous. The philosophy of enlightenment still hesitates to annul the coerced alliance and to seek a new relation to the sciences. The modern equation of reason and science is too powerful for philosophy, if it does not want to destroy itself, to simply push aside the advantages of the sciences. Nevertheless, the signs of the times indicate a twilight of the scientific idols. Since the time of European Romanticism, so-called irrationalist currents have repeatedly resisted the process of modern rationalism. The present also is experiencing such a wave of anti-rationalism, in which the motifs of another kind of reason combine with each other, motifs of a logic of feelings and mysticism, of meditation and critical self-reflection, of myth and a magical worldview. It would probably be wasted time to try to sort out the grain from the chaff. Time will tell which impulses survive the fad phase. As soon as American syncretism comes and goes, here, and the first titillation of anything goes is worn off, perhaps the charms of clarity too will again be valued. In the long run, murky mixtures are unpleasant. Where anything goes, nothing matters anymore. But we have to grit our teeth and bear it. Beyond the mechanics of pendulum swings between fascination and boredom, enlightenment still has the task of assigning an appropriate place in our culture to the sciences. A prerequisite for this would be the clarification of the relationship between types of intelligence, particularly of various opposing kinds of cleverness, such as science and wisdom, learnedness and presence of mind. The distancing of the types of intelligence from each other that in modern reason are only illusorily brought together in a unity of rationality has long been obvious. What Georg Lukács, for example, attacked as irrationalism in modern bourgeois thinking, the destruction of reason, contains in its basic impulse a fully justified separation of another kind of intelligence from the hegemony of rationalism and natural science. The only bad thing here is that irrationalism from Bergson to Klages took itself much too seriously. It fell over itself with its pretensions to respectability and struck up the solemn tome of a priest. the solemn tone of a priest where a great philosophical buffoonery would have been just the right thing. In pronounced irrationalist literature, one often finds a mixture of theorizing melancholy and self-pretension. Still, Bergson did at least write about laughter. The bourgeois compulsion for respectability spoiled the satirical, poetical, and ironic possibilities of irrationalism. Those who see the other should also tell it otherwise. But those who present what they have grasped beyond the limits of a narrower rationality, claiming nothing less than validity of the most respectable insights, degrade both the irrational and the rational. Thus, Gottfried Benn struck at the heart of oracle irrationalism when he said that in Germany, thinkers who cannot master their world pictures linguistically are usually called visionaries. Respectable conservatism has known much of this for a long time. Under its frequently demagogic wailing about the evils of progress, it has preserved the insight that the modern kind of knowledge has little to do with the state of human maturity that is called wisdom by all great teachers. Wisdom is not dependent on the level of the technical mastery of the world. Conversely, the latter presupposes the former when the process of science and technology moves towards an insane state of affairs, as we are observing today. With the aid of Buddhist, Taoist, and original Christian, Indian and American Indian intelligence, no production lines and no satellites can be built. However, in the modern type of knowledge, that awareness of life dries up from which the old teachings of wisdom take their inspiration. In order to speak of life and death, love and hate, antagonism and unity, individuality and cosmos, manliness and womanliness. One of the most important motifs in the literature of wisdom is a warning against false cleverness, against head knowledge and learnedness, against thinking in terms of power and arrogant intellectuality.